Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Absolutely. So we are expecting to hear from President Biden, and these remarks actually just popping up on his schedule just a short time ago. And it seems as though these remarks are very strategically placed as the House is set to reconvene at 2 o'clock. What are we expecting from President Biden as he delivers his remarks?
This is very important to President Biden, obviously, for a legacy achievement. He's probably going to excoriate Donald Trump and say that Donald Trump is the reason there's a lot of opposition in the House. The reason Mike Johnson has been hesitant to take up the measure in the first place. He's probably going to praise the Senate and say that the Senate passed bipartisan legislation. He might try to divide the Republican Party, saying if there are thoughtful Republicans that voted for the measure, and then say that there are MAGA Republicans that are essentially under the tutelage of Donald Trump, and try to kind of separate the two. I think that's basically what his goal is going to be.
It's interesting because last week the Senate had a test vote on a bill, but it was also tied to border security, and this test vote did not pass. And so there was an additional bill where it removed the border security. So the Senate has passed that standalone package. Why wouldn't the standalone package then have a chance potentially in the House?
Yeah, you would think so. But part of it is there is certain opposition. Part of it, I think, is that it just shows how hegemonic Donald Trump really is over the respective Republican Party. If he says he does not want this, there are many Republicans who represent congressional districts where Donald Trump is a lot more popular than they are. The districts have been so gerrymandered. So as soon as Donald Trump comes out and says something and says, do not vote for this, essentially this bill is not perfect, they kind of have to follow the orders and do that. Now, that being said, some of them may have those convictions, and frankly, their constituents, because they come from such conservative congressional districts, also have that. Also have those convictions not to bring it up. But just from a purely base perspective, also, I think Donald Trump and the Republicans want this as an issue to say that the Democrats have been ineffectual on border security. And the fact that they would try to separate the two, he'll try to say something to the effect, I think this is the argument that Donald Trump will make in the debates next year, assuming he's the Republican presidential nominee, something to the effect of they voted for $60 billion for Ukraine, for aid to the Ukraine, yet they won't secure our own border. That's probably the talking points that the president will probably use. And I think many of his surrogates and many down ballot candidates in primaries and conservative districts will try to do the same.
It's interesting because last week we heard from Senator Lankford, who helped to co-author the bipartisan bill that also was tied to border security. And one of his arguments was that, in Washington, border security is a political issue, but anywhere beyond the 202 area code or the 212 area code, it becomes an issue of national security. And that's also been an argument for additional foreign aid to Ukraine and to Israel, in that these are security issues and there could be potential ramifications if additional aid is not given to those countries.
Yes, and also there is aid, for example, to refugees. There's aid to Gaza. There's aid to there's aid to other parts of the world in terms of humanitarian types of issues. But James Lansford, he's basically an institutionalist. Yes, he's a conservative, but he's a legislator first. He came to the United States Congress basically to be an institutionalist, to try to get something done. And there are differences between those institutionalists and ideologues. There are those in the Republican Party, and there's some on the left in the Democratic Party as well, who basically came to Washington because they wanted to set an ideological agenda. They weren't there to try to say, all right, I'm going to try to get this much money for my state, this much money for my district. They're basically there to kind of prove a point, if you will, and to be an advocate for the gospel of their ideology. In their case, the kind of populist, conservative, Trumpian version of conservatism. And James Lankford said that one of the commentators, who's a very conservative commentator, basically told him that they were going to destroy him if he supported this measure. And if he worked with Chris Murphy, a progressive Democrat from Connecticut, and Kyrsten Sinema, a centrist independent who caucuses with Democrat Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. So that's his essential case. That's why if you look at the Republicans who are supporting this measure, they tend to be the ones that are more or less the institutionalists, the ones, frankly, that sometimes you don't hear of very often. James Lankford is a senator that really does not garner a lot of publicity as does, say, a Ted Cruz or a Bernie Sanders, who get a lot more media publicity. So that's where he's coming from, and that's kind of this internecine fight within the Republican Party in the United States Congress today.
So let's take a look at the breakdown of the House, because House Speaker Mike Johnson is very much against these bills, so to speak. And many people have said, well, could former President Donald Trump be pressuring Mike Johnson into taking a stand when it comes to Congress? What is the sentiment? Is there concern that there could be backlash like what we saw with Republican Senator Lankford?
Absolutely. And in the case of Speaker Mike Johnson, he's in a very precarious position because he saw what happened to his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy. All that had to happen was Matt Gaetz, a conservative kind of rebel, if you will, got about 8 other Republicans to vote with every solitary Democrat. And what happened? They had a motion to vacate the chair, and Kevin McCarthy is no longer Speaker. Now, Mike Johnson was one of the more conservative members of the House of Representatives. He really came as a rebel. If you look at, for example, his website, there's a lot more about, for example, about conservative values than there is for, this is what I'm trying to do for Shreveport, this is what I'm trying to do for my congressional district. He basically came here to set a conservative agenda, and I think some Republicans have become somewhat trepidatious toward him. Some of the more conservative members, they think that he's too willing to compromise. He's too much of a greenhorn, if you will. He's too much willing to acquiesce to Joe Biden. If he continues to do that, then all Donald Trump has to do is call up someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz and say, we have to get this guy out of here. Then they get the Republicans, and you see how close the current makeup of Congress is. It would be very easy to get him out of the Speaker's chair right now and try to put somebody else in. And I think he knows that. And I think it's from a purely political, over anything partisan, but purely political standpoint, it is best for him, I think, to kind of follow along with anything that Donald Trump bequests him to do.
So speaking of House Speaker Mike Johnson, let's talk about the potential second vote to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. That is also expected to happen today in the House. Last week, we saw that vote to impeach Mayorkas failed, and that really has been part of Johnson's agenda, some calling it an embarrassment for him. They're going to take up that issue again today. Could we see a different outcome?
I don't know if you would, because first of all, the last time around, I think he really miscalculated. And this really shows kind of what a neophyte he is as Speaker. For one thing, he thought that Al Green, a liberal Democrat from Texas, would not be there. He was sick, but they basically wheeled him in, and he was able to vote. Frankly, I don't know. The House of Representatives is so close; they literally have a single-digit majority. And there are 2 problems right now. One of them is George Santos. George Santos is no longer in Congress, and you wonder, why do they want to keep him in the House so much? Because they needed his vote. There's a special election today in New York in that congressional district, and if there's a Republican that gets elected, that certainly would help them down the road. And the other one is Kevin McCarthy. When Kevin McCarthy resigned, not only is he no longer Speaker, he also resigned his congressional seat from Bakersfield, meaning that when they did the vote last time, Kevin McCarthy and George Santos were not there. It literally failed by 1 vote. Had Kevin McCarthy stayed in the House of Representatives, it would have been pretty much tied. And then Mike Johnson, in this very rare position where the Speaker actually votes, would be breaking the tie. We'll see if he miscalculated, but it's obviously a very interesting position. And the 4 recalcitrant Republicans who voted against it last time, one of them is a procedural rule, are going to really be in the crosshairs. Now, some of them, like Congressman Ken Buck, who's very conservative from Colorado, actually represents a district that Lauren Boebert moved into. He's no longer running for re-election and probably does not have a political future ahead of him, so he can kind of do whatever he wants. Others like Tom McClintock, I can really see President Trump and others really kind of coming down on him. But it's fascinating that if you think about it, Kevin McCarthy was one of the leaders in the movement to impeach him back in 2022 when he was just House Minority Leader. Then he's now perhaps the reason why he was able to hold the office, at least not to hold the office, rather not to be impeached by the House. I think most people know that once it gets to the Senate, they will not get the requisite 2/3 that they need to actually convict him. So it's more of a political exercise in the first place, because if it's certainly you're not going to get any. You would be very hard pressed to get any Democrats to vote that way, and you're probably going to get about 20 Republicans that would vote against conviction as well.
So, question for you. Let's say the House votes not to impeach Mayorkas a second time. What does that mean for Johnson and, how his constituents look at him and the power that he has?
Yeah, he's got two. Though you got to bifurcate two different types of constituents. On the one side, you have constituents in his congressional district in Louisiana, the Shreveport area. They're probably going to be with him. The only possible headache he could have would be if he's seen as not being too conservative and acquiescing to the Republicans. And theoretically, there could be a primary challenge or a write-in campaign like what happened with Eric Cantor back in 2014 when he was seen as trying to compromising too much with the Obama administration on the issue of immigration. And what happened? David Bratt, a professor that very few people had heard of, runs against him in the primary, defeats him in the primary. So that's that's his fear with his own constituents. In terms of constituents within the Republican Party, on the one hand, he's showing his conservative bona fides by advocating this for bringing it to the floor. But on the other hand, though, contrary-wise, rather, he's really showing, I think, in a sense, how feckless his leadership can be. If that was Nancy Pelosi or Sam Rayburn or Newt Gingrich, they wouldn't have known they would have known they have not had the votes. They would not have brought that to the floor. But Mike Johnson thought he had the votes. He miscalculated. And you wonder if there are some of the more conservative members of the House of Representatives are thinking, is there somebody else like Byron Donalds of Florida, for example, they could put up for speaker that's not only an ideologue, but also a tactician who's very contemplative in terms of in terms of what to put up for legislation, but also calculative, if you will, in terms of how to get it actually through the House of Representatives.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when the House reconvenes today and how the votes come down. Rich Rubino, political analyst, thank you so much again for taking the time to give your perspective on these issues.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Absolutely.